In a crumbling apartment block on Chicago's South Side, Ruthie Mae McCoy made a terrified call to police, claiming someone was coming through her bathroom mirror. Many dismissed her words as panic, like something torn from the old legend of Bloody Mary. But when silence finally settled over the apartment, the story became far harder to explain and far more unsettling to remember. Hear the full story over on my true crime channel, Saturn Soul, linked down below. Growing up, I used to think all fathers were just quiet, scary, and uninterested in their children. But then I realized other kids as dads did things like make time to eat with them, or take them to the movies, or even just smile. I thought it was normal for dad to yell and mom to cry for hours afterwards, so realizing that wasn't and that other kids' parents were actually happy together, it broke my heart. To the point that when my mom told me that they were going to get a divorce, I honestly thought, finally. I know that probably sounds pretty bleak to some, and I guess it is, but that was just how I grew up. The tragedy wasn't the divorce, it was them being married in the first place. And the only downside was having mom bring home the guys that she was dating and having them awkwardly audition to be my future stepdad. Dad only reached out once, too, on my 18th birthday, and even then, the letter didn't arrive until weeks afterwards and made very little sense. It was postmarked from Alaska, and only two things were written: "Happy birthday," and "Take care of yourself. You're going to be a very important person one day." And I remember tossing the letter in the trash thinking, important, huh? Not to you, apparently. And that was it for another 9 years. Until 2017, when mom received a phone call from some attorney up in Alaska. At first, she had a real what is it now kind of attitude. But then the guy told her how dad had passed, and that changed everything for her. She didn't cry, not in front of me anyway, but she stopped crap-talking him every chance she got, and I guess because she decided that since he was no longer around to defend himself, some deference for the dead was due. She stayed in touch with that attorney, who sent over a bunch of documents for her to read and sign, and that's how we found out that not long after he left us, Dad had bought a plot of land up there in the middle of nowhere. He built a cabin on it, and he lived there until he got too sick to live alone anymore, and he spent his last 2 weeks in an Anchorage hospice writing letters and organizing his estate, and one of those letters was addressed to me. It was a highly emotional time, and I guess that must seem like some kind of understatement, but losing him bothered me a lot more than I thought it would. He'd been gone almost 15 years, but I still figured that we might have time to reconnect and that he might reach out during his dying days. Well, it turns out he did, just not in the way I pictured it. I waited until I was alone to read it, then the moment I read the words, "I'm sorry," the tears started to fall, and they didn't stop until I was in bed, very drunk and drifting off to sleep. I only really focused on the first half that night, the part that talked about how sorry he was that he wasn't more present with us. The second half was a kind of non-explanation with cryptic references to a job that he had up there that forced him to stay in Alaska, as well as instructions for what to do with the land that he owned up there. And I didn't really read that part, not until the morning when my faculties had finally returned. Correctly assuming that I wouldn't want to live up there in his cabin, Dad organized the sale of his land prior to his deth. All he needed me to do was travel up to Alaska, sign some papers with the attorney that had contacted Mom, and then drive up to the cabin to hand over the deeds to the buyer. Obviously, this all sounded very needlessly convoluted until I found out that the buyer was another old-timer living out in the sticks on his own, who wasn't capable of driving all the way down to Anchorage while leaving his homestead unattended. I also think that I might have questioned everything a little more if it didn't amount to Dad's dying wishes. But once it was confirmed by the attorney that Dad wanted me to visit the place so I could see it for myself, my mind was made up and I flew up to Anchorage in the late summer of 2017. I landed late in the afternoon, then met with the attorney that Mom had been talking to after a quick bite to eat. He was a nice guy, apologized for my loss, and made sure that I understood exactly what was being signed over and to who. He also apologized for not volunteering to do all the legwork himself, and he would have had Dad not instructed him otherwise. He gave me a set of keys I assumed were for the cabin, told me that I was to bring at least 2 large cans of gas for the generator, and then when he asked how I was getting up to Fairbanks, I told him I had a flight in the next morning, and that's when he gave me a set of handwritten instructions Dad had given him, which would guide me from a small village named Chattanooga to the land his cabin was on. I was easily able to find Chattanooga, and then from there, it was just a case of driving down the Steese Highway until I reached a particular mile marker and an unmarked turnoff. And from there, my dad's instructions got very weird. First off, he'd written that under no circumstances whatsoever was I to drive any sort of vehicle down the dirt road, and that it was essential that I followed his instructions to the letter on that one. And then secondly, he'd written that no matter what I saw, no matter how dangerous it looked, I'd be okay if I stayed on the road, the path, and in the cabin. Anywhere else, and he couldn't guarantee my safety. I remember sitting there, parked off the highway, wondering what in the hell Dad had gotten himself into, and more pertinently, what I'd gotten myself into. Gone was that apologetic, I wish things could have been different tone. What was written on the smaller note was more like frantic or frightened, I guess because he knew my safety would be at stake. Now, I was also wondering if Dad had given the same instructions to the person that I was supposed to be meeting there, but assuming he had, I parked the car, turned off the engine, and then started walking down the dirt road once I'd climbed out of the driver's seat. And I'd be lying if I said that I wasn't a little scared. At first glance, it looked like a pretty unremarkable dirt road, but like any other you might find out in the middle of nowhere. I couldn't tell exactly how long it was thanks to 2 fairly sharp crooks in the road and all the pine trees that lined it, but after about half a mile of walking, I found the cabin. But not before I saw 1 or 2 things which bothered me, and those things being empty bullet casings which littered the sides of the track near the trees. Okay, maybe littered is too strong of a word because I only spotted maybe 20 to 30 as I walked, but they were only ever behind or near tree trunks, never out in the open, which suggested that they'd been fired from cover at the cabin and not at some passing deer destined for my dad's freezer. I'd like to say that things made more sense when I saw all the barbed wire on the wall surrounding my dad's cabin compound, but they didn't. Whoever Dad had built that wall to keep out, all that barbed wire hadn't seemed to deter them from trying to get in. But all I could focus on at the time was where the hell were they now, and what the hell had my dad been up to out there? There was a big wooden gate that I had to use to gain access, and since it was unlocked and slightly ajar, I figured the guy that I was supposed to be meeting was already there. But when I pushed it open and stepped inside while saying, "Hello? Anyone here?" no one answered. I was planning on saying it again, but what I saw when I walked inside the compound quite literally took my breath away. Because far from the peaceful, off-the-grid living I'd imagined, the place looked like a war zone. Right underneath one of the southern-facing walls is the one facing the highway where I'd left the rental car. Dad had dug a shallow pit, maybe 3 feet deep, and then he'd lined it with sharpened wooden stakes. It was quite obviously a trap designed for anyone who came over that wall after getting rid of the barbed wire. But as much as I wanted to get a closer look, I remembered what Dad had written about not straying off the path. There were more traps on the other side of the path, and I saw 2 wooden stakes with some kind of tripwire strung between them, and while I didn't see any obvious signs of explosives, I obviously didn't want to go digging around looking for any and stayed right where I was. Now I turned back towards the cabin, assuming that it was going to be a mess on the inside, and I was right. There was a workbench in one corner, a small bed, and then a stove and fireplace in the other. The workbench looked like it had been used to carve the stakes, and I'm no expert, but All the nails and gunpowder reminded me of stuff that they found in the Unabomber's cabin after they tracked him down. But even with all of that, two things demanded my attention more than the others. The first was the hatch in the center of the floor, one that had been chained shut and padlocked twice, and the second were the big white letters that had been painted on the walls. I remember exactly what they said word for word. They said, "Open the hatch, pour in the gas, burn it all down, don't let them have it." Then, in even bigger and bolder letters, it said, "Don't go down." The attorney had given me a small key ring with 2 keys on it, and I assumed that they were for a gate and a front door, but I was wrong. They were for the padlocks. Now, I hadn't forgotten to bring those cans full of gas with me, but I did deliberately leave them in my trunk. Now, I didn't really feel like lugging those 2 cans down the road without being sure of what was down there first. So after a few tense moments of contemplation, I started on the walk back to my car. I wasn't even 100% sure of what I was going to do before I reached it because it's like half a mile walk, right? And the whole time I'm thinking to myself, just what in the hell is going on here? Now, I was kind of mad too because it was very obvious by that stage that I'd been deceived, and posthumously at that, because the signing the place over thing had seemed legitimate and valid and such. Dad didn't want me to see that cabin just for the sake of it. Something was in the basement of that place. And out of the many questions running through my mind, the primary one was, what? Was it human remains, drugs, some kind of incriminating material Dad wanted destroyed? Because if it was, I didn't want a single goddamn thing to do with it. I was half ready to just get back into that rental car and drive off into the sunset. My dad didn't want anything to do with us after he left, so why the F should I be doing his dirty work for him? But as I pulled the car keys from my pocket and walked towards the driver's door, a sudden and burning curiosity stopped me from unlocking it, and instead, I walked around to the trunk and grabbed one of those cans of gasoline. I realized that if I left without at least getting a look at what was down beneath that hatch, it'd bother me for the rest of my life. It would have also been a huge waste of time and resources to just turn around and go home now that I was there. So having cooled off from being mad about this deception, I started off down the dirt road again towards the cabin and the small compound that contained it. On arriving, I set the can down near the hatch and then unlocked the 2 padlocks and pulled the chain away. I figured opening it would reveal a small root cellar, but instead, I saw a steep tunnel that looked like it ran deep into the earth. I was also ready to be hit by the smell of rotten death, but to my surprise, there was nothing like that. Just this slightly damp, musty smell that smelled surprisingly clean compared to what I was expecting. I obviously felt a huge amount of relief knowing my dad wasn't some serial killer, using the cabin as a dumping ground, but I couldn't tell how deep the tunnel went on account of how dark it was down there. But even after shining the flashlight I found down the tunnel, I still couldn't see all the way to the bottom. I looked this up when I got home and read that the tunnel must have been more than 70 yards to 100 yards deep depending on the strength of the flashlight, but that's why my dad told me 2 cans minimum, one for the tunnel and one for the cabin. I ended up going back to my car to get the second can, and I also grabbed the flashlight out of the rental's glove compartment, hoping that it was stronger than the one in the cabin. Unfortunately, that one wasn't strong enough either, and while there was a fleeting temptation to crawl inside a little in the hopes that I might spot something, it was impossible to forget what it said on the wall, because it was right there in front of me. Don't go down. I unscrewed the cap on one of the cans and then poured the entirety of it down the tunnel. Now, I didn't have to search for a lighter. I still hadn't quit smoking yet back then, and then after lighting up a page that I'd torn from a book, I tossed it down the tunnel and watched the rush of flame. Something burned at the bottom all right. I could see the flames getting larger as whatever was down there caught on fire, but I couldn't make out what. It didn't make any noise. It didn't emit any weird or barbecue-like smells, thank God, and it didn't explode or anything either. It just quietly burned as I watched it, wondering what the hell it might have been. Next, I did the same thing with the cabin, doused it in gasoline, walked outside, and then tossed in a burning book to light the whole place on fire. The stone walls of the compound would make for a controlled burn, so I didn't have to supervise it to make sure that the fire didn't spread. And so after lighting the place up, I took one last look at it and walked out into the road and back towards my car. It was a weird feeling, driving off glad that I was done with the place, but with so many mixed emotions about what I just did. In a way, I felt kind of dumb for just following the instructions and doing something so long and convoluted for someone who didn't give a damn about me when I was alive. But at the same time, it was the closest I'd felt to my father in years, and in a weird way, him asking me to burn the cabin down was proof he did care, if only in a very cold and distant way. I told Mom everything when I got back, and she listened especially intently to everything that happened once I'd reached Dad's land. Mom got back in touch with the attorney and pretty much begged him to tell us anything he could about Dad that he hadn't already. But he was just an attorney, and one who'd only met my dad about a week before he died, and one who only knew what was in his will and really nothing more. It was clear that he had no idea how he'd been living or what he'd been doing, and both me and Mom have spent almost every day since wondering why he chose to live up there and who he was defending himself against. I'll never really get to know the man who raised me, the things he did or the things that occupied his mind, but maybe, just maybe, that's for the best. I've been a search and rescue officer for almost 20 years now, and of all the rescue operations I've ever been a part of, which must be coming up on close to 100 now, this is the one that stayed with me the most. We were on night shift when the call came in, sitting in what amounted to the lounge over at HQ. There was myself, two guys named Kobe and Rogers, and our team leader, Spence. The TV in the corner was on some random channel with the volume down as usual, and I was helping myself to my second cup of coffee as Kobe updated the weather overlay on the topo maps. I think Rogers was checking gear bags while Spence kicked back in a chair reading a book. But we didn't mind. He'd been pulling people out of danger since we were all in diapers, meaning he'd earned the right to put his feet up. And that is what the typical on-call shift looked like. Quiet, but not relaxed, because we were always waiting for that crackle of our radios and voice of some country dispatcher telling us where we were needed. And then when it came time, we sprang into action. We had a missing hiker on our hands here, a male in his mid-50s who was overdue by 2 days from a solo backpacking trip up in the Cascades. The weather had been pretty good the past few days, but this guy was up in the northern Cascades, and up there, they've got steep draws, thick timber, and rock faces that'll eat up your cell phone signal, so we knew right away that we might be in for a challenge. And the only silver lining was that the guy had needed a permit to camp out there, and on the form, he got to list the rough locations of the places he was planning on camping at. And this meant that we could drastically narrow down our search area, making our job much easier, and so after we fired up the bird, we did our checks and lifted off. I was the hoist operator that day, with Rogers as pilot, Spence as the spotter/team leader, and Kobe as our medic. We arrived at dawn after a fairly smooth flight, and it only took about a half hour of flying valleys and ridgelines before Spence called out the campfire smoke. It was late spring, so only the highest peaks still had snow. Then as we got closer, he spotted a tent up in a small clearing. We orbited, confirming the tent matched the description of our missing hikers, and then as we did, the guy came out of his tent and started waving us off. At first, it looked like he was waving us in and trying to direct us towards a place to land, but then after slowing and dropping enough so we could use the hoist, I realized what he was really doing. He was throwing his arms away from himself with open palms, and unlike almost everyone else we rescued from certain doom, he did not look happy to see us. I rigged in for the hoist while Raj got us a good hover spot, and then once we were about at 70 feet and the cable was ready, I gave the thumbs up and they slowly lowered me down to the ground. I could hear him yelling as I got close to him, but I couldn't make out what he was saying over the sound of the bird's rotors. His tent was pitched neatly and the pack laying next to it looked organized, but the guy himself looked rough with dirty clothes, a wild beard, and eyes that looked way too wide to belong to anyone lucid. After my feet hit the dirt and I unhooked, I identified myself with a standard SAR intro. I yelled out my name, what agency I was with, and made it clear that I was there to help, but he didn't seem interested in any of it. He just kept yelling over me, saying me and my crew needed to get out of there right now, before they changed their minds and wouldn't let us. I'd encountered stuff like that before with lost hikers and campers, especially out in the backcountry. When people get lost, they get exhausted, malnourished, and dehydrated. And then once they get isolated for a couple of days, sometimes their heads start spinning, and they start thinking all kinds of crazy thoughts that they would never have among civilization. Now, I had to keep on yelling at him, but I did it slowly, with my palms out flat and my voice even. We're trained on how to deal with people who might be in heightened states of fear or confusion when we encounter them, so I just leaned on my training and with a smile, said that I was there to get him back to his family who missed him very much. But instead of getting through to him, the guy got very frustrated and started angrily yelling about how I wasn't listening. He then started saying how they had been watching him and that he'd built a stone circle to keep them at bay. I remember my eyes darting to my left, following his hand as he gestured, then lo and behold, there was indeed a rough circle of stones surrounding us. It had to be around 20 feet across, made of rocks large and small, and while there were fairly sizable gaps in between, it was clear that he'd spent quite a while hauling the rocks back and forth to form that shape. And by the time I radioed up to the bird to give them a situation report, the guy was yelling, "You're a part of it now. Tell them to leave. Tell them to leave." I told the guys that the subject was located and that he was conscious but refusing evacuation, and that we had a possible psych case on our hands, i.e. a mental health emergency. They acknowledged and said that I had exactly 35 minutes to work the guy toward the hoist. We only had so much fuel to work with, so if I couldn't do it in that allotted time, we had to just mark his position and then pass it on to the forest rangers. I asked the guy's name as I offered him some water, but he kept saying that that wasn't important, that I wasn't listening, and so I launched into reasoning with him instead. I told him the rocks were just rocks, and that there were no special place and that if someone was threatening him, he'd be safe if he came with us. But he kept at it, saying I didn't get it and that they'd get us if we tried to leave. Now this went on for maybe 10 minutes or so, with me trying to build that rapport, keeping him talking, and maybe get him to step outside the stones to show him that it was just all in his head. Now by the end, he was practically begging me to tell my crew to get out of there while they still could. And then, it happened. Rogers came on comm saying that the bird had a mechanical issue and that there were warning lights flashing and that they had to return to base. They asked if I was good to stay with the guy to make sure that it didn't run off or anything. And then since it was most likely a psych issue and I was only likely to be alone with him for a couple of hours at most, I said I didn't mind. Being left on the ground wasn't ideal, but it happened, so I was prepared for it. I had my personal locator, sat phone backup, extra layers, and the guy wasn't violent yet, so I had no reason to reasonably decline. When I told the guy the helicopter was leaving, he actually looked relieved, and then launched back into his rant about how they needed to leave and how we needed to stay in that circle. And after hauling the cable up, the helo turned around and we watched it fly away. Now, as silence returned to the mountains, I tried playing along with the guy to some degree. I let him explain things as best he could, which seemed to calm him, and he told me how each stone was placed in alignments with the peaks around us. If the circles stayed intact, they couldn't fully manifest, whereas if we existed inside it together, we were safe. Now, in as friendly a manner as possible, I asked the guy who they were, and he said he didn't know, but then made clear that he'd seen them following him and that he wasn't just imagining anything. Now, I didn't believe anything that guy had to say about his stone circle, but I did have to consider the possibility that someone was following him, someone intent on doing him harm. And if they were intent on doing our missing hiker harm, then I could only assume that they'd subject me to a similar treatment. In which case, I had to get him the hell out of this circle and to some place they wouldn't find us until the chopper returned. Convinced that all I needed to do was demonstrate reality, I walked out to the boundary and stepped over it. I'm not sure why I was expecting a good reaction. I just figured whatever it was would be a little less animated, shall we say. But when I stepped over that imaginary line and exposed his little fantasy as fiction, the guy lost it. He kind of stuttered and stammered at first, choking on his words while clenching his jaw. Then, after his face went so red it seemed like he was about to burst a blood vessel, he came at me. He moved fast for an old guy, arms desperately swinging, and then he tried tackling me by the waist. I managed to hold my ground, but as he's grappling, he's saying things like, I'm sorry, they're making me, they're in my head. Apologizing, even as he tried to wrap his hands around my neck to choke me. Now, I'm not a small guy, and I'm trained to deal with that kind of stuff too, so all I had to do was get some leverage, get him on the ground, and then put him in a hold. I managed to do so without hurting him, but then, even as I'm holding him steadily, I'm trying to talk him down, saying things like, Easy, buddy. You don't have to do this, so just stop. He had a whole lot of fight in him, but eventually he started to slow. And then, when the fight went out of him altogether, he started to cry. He was still muttering about them as I zip-tied his hands around his front for safety, and then I sat him down against a tree trunk inside his little circle and checked him over for injuries. Now, once I'd confirmed that he was okay, I updated dispatch on the situation. They noted it, then relayed that the bird was on deck back at base with maintenance crews swarming it, and they'd be back with me as soon as possible. I trusted that they'd be true to their word, but the next couple of hours still felt like a heck of a long time. The guy eventually told me his name was John, but talking to him was hard, and every time I'd ask about his family or his life back in the world, he'd find a way to tell me about them again, and how they'd been following him from the ridgeline for the past couple of days. I just had to run out the clock by that point, so I just listened, nodded, then tried to keep him as grounded in reality as possible. I offered him food and water, kept his mind on the familiar by asking him where he was from, where he went to school, stuff like that. He seemed to respond a little better to questions like that once the fight was out of him, but he never stopped being frightened. Now, I kept getting updates from dispatch, so I knew the second the bird was on its way back to me, and then when I finally heard its rotor blades beating the air, I breathed a huge sigh of relief. John kept saying how they'd get us, but only weakly by then, and how I was able to get him on his feet and walking towards the edge of the stone circle without him freaking out at the prospect of leaving it. I radioed up to the bird as it started to hover, saying that the situation had been resolved. But then the second me and John stepped out of the circle, he collapsed in some pile. I tried to catch him, but it was like someone just cut his strings and folded him up. I tried to get him back on his back, and I saw his eyes were open but completely blank. There was no response to voice, no pain reaction when I did a sternal rub, which is hard knuckle grinding on the chest bone. It was like he'd fallen into some kind of trance. It scared the hell out of me how sudden it was, but I just kept on doing my job and called for the litter. Kobe lowered it, having taken over hoist duties until I got back on board, and then after I carefully packaged John into that litter, with the straps tight, an oxygen mask on, the cervical collar just in case, they winched him up and then me in turn. John, which turned out not to be his real name, stayed out for the whole flight. The medics met us at the landing zone, took him into the hospital after we unloaded him, and then that was the last we saw of him. But not the last we heard of him. We got a copy of the report later with the doctors confirming some kind of acute psychotic break triggered by isolation, which was possibly an underlying condition. There were no drugs in his system, no head injury that we could find, and in fact, his physical health was pretty good considering that he'd been out there for a few days having already run out of food and water. Now, he recovered after a couple of days in the hospital, but apparently he'd had no memory of attacking me or any kind of stuff about the stone circle. Apparently his family said that he'd been stressed for weeks before the trip and was talking about feeling watched. And so, from our perspective, it was case closed, really, for what was a pretty standard SNR incident file. We debriefed back at the station, talked about psyche vows for extended missions, and discussed having some better comms when leaving a rescuer on the ground. But the thing that bothers me still was how real it all seemed to him. It's something about the way he apologized while his hands were grasping for my neck, like something else was driving. And then the way he collapsed the instant he left those stones. I've pulled plenty of people out of danger, people who were hypothermic, injured, or dangerously dehydrated, but no one ever acted like he did. We got him home safe, which from our perspective is a job well done, but it's one that haunts me far more than I like to admit. The single craziest, most horrifying thing I ever personally witnessed in my whole damn life happened while I was out hiking a wilderness trail one summer. Now, I was out in the Adirondacks, just me and my pack, putting down miles and burning off stress. It had been a beautiful morning too, bright blue sky, not a cloud in sight, and so quiet up there that you could hear a rat pissing on cotton, as they say. Now, I've been hiking since first light, and I just hit a big open meadow ringed by thick forest and a rocky ridge on the far side, when from behind me, I heard a low hum. I turned around, shaded my eyes, and looked up, and then sure enough, I spotted a little single-engine plane coming over the trees. You don't get a lot of air traffic in places like that, so I thought that it was pretty cool to sightsee a little single-engine flying low up there in the mountains. I smiled to myself, stopped to watch it pass, and even waved like an idiot, even though I was pretty sure that the pilot wouldn't be able to see me. Now, even though I could hear that low hum getting louder and louder, it was still kind of peaceful watching that thing soar through the big blue sky. But then, the noise from the engine suddenly changed. It went from a smooth drone to sort of a rough, coughing sputter, and then the plane started wobbling in the air. One wing dipped a little before the pilot straightened her out, and then as the engine started actually cutting in and out, my stomach started to drop. It started to lose altitude fast, and it was obviously going to crash land in the meadow that I was walking through. I backed up, but there was still some distance between us, and I mentally prepared myself to run over and help the pilot once it pancaked. But then I'm guessing the pilot realized that he was going to hit the rock face jutting up on the edge of the meadow because the plane banked hard, swung around, and was suddenly pointed right at me. Now for a second I just froze. That thing was coming down like a rock, nose dipping and wings tilting, and the noise it made. Jesus Christ, I'll never forget that ear-splitting whir that it made as it came down. I turned and ran, my pack bouncing on my back as my legs pumped, and the whole time the noise got louder and louder and louder. And the last thing I did before I felt the impact was dive behind a little cluster of boulders near the tree line in the hopes that it'd provide adequate cover. And then boom. The impact was beyond brutal. Metal screeching, white dirt and grass flew up in a cloud. The plane skidded and flipped part way as one wing seemed to snap off completely. Smoke was already pouring from the engine by the time it came to a stop, and then as I ran towards the smoking wreckage, the smell of fuel hit me hard. I reached the cockpit and yanked at the door, only to find that it was jammed. I got it open with a good couple of strong yanks, but found the pilot slumped over, not moving, blood all over his face. I grabbed him by the shoulders and tried to haul him out of the cockpit, but found his leg was caught on something. I yelled at him to wake up as the smoke was starting to get thicker, pulling harder as I began to hear the cackle of flames coming from underneath us. My hands were shaking as I managed to get him halfway out, but no matter how hard I pulled at his leg, it wouldn't come unstuck. I tried and tried, yelling as loud as I could in the hopes that the pilot would wake up, But he didn't, and when I saw the way his head fell as I got him halfway out, I could tell that he was dead. I had the briefest of moments thinking, "You poor son of a bitch." And then the flames jumped up fast. I had to let go and stumble away, coughing my lungs up while my eyes burned. There was nothing I could do anymore, nothing I could do for him. And so I tried to gather my thoughts and figure out what to do. The wreck became a full-on blaze right there in front of me, with a column of black smoke rising into that sky. Now I knew I had to tell someone, and that meant getting to a ranger station as quickly as possible, but my legs felt like jelly. All I could think about was how close I'd been to death, and how if that pilot had turned a little earlier, I might be squished under the wreckage only to be thoroughly barbecued by the flames that followed. Now the thought made me feel sick as I pushed towards the trailhead, and while it turned out the nearest ranger station was actually only a couple of miles away, the walk felt like forever. I kept looking back over my shoulder at the smoke plume because at that time of year, with all the vegetation starting to dry out, one plane crash could light up the whole freaking forest. I remember bursting through the door of the station and telling an older-looking ranger that there had been a plane crash. I knew almost exactly where it had crashed, so I was able to point out the area on their map, and the ranger then got on his radio and contacted the local fire crews so they could get up there and douse the flames before they spread. I sat on the porch afterwards drinking a bottle of water that the ranger gave me and still shaking a little from the adrenaline. The ranger, a guy named Mike, came out and clapped me on the shoulder, telling me I did good. We traded numbers before I departed, and then a couple of days later, Mike gave me a call with an update. I asked him to keep me informed of anything he learned, especially regarding who that pilot was. Well, it turned out he was only a couple of years older than me, and he crashed during his first solo flight after gaining his pilot license. And this hit me harder than I expected. I kept thinking about that guy up there probably grinning ear to ear when he took off that morning feeling free as a bird. And then it all went wrong. One faulty engine and it was over, and I almost died with him. The next morning, as in the morning after the crash, not when Mike called me, my mind wouldn't stop replaying the sound of the engine dying, and every time I heard the car engine or saw or heard a plane flying overhead, I pictured the way the single engine turned in the air and came straight at me. I went back out hiking a few weeks later on the same trails in the same meadow. The wreck was gone by then, just a scorched patch in the grass and some twisted metal that hadn't hauled out yet. Now, I remember just standing there for a while listening to the quiet and saying a silent prayer for that poor guy who died. That morning changed how I looked at the sky. Years later, whenever I hear a plane in the distance, sometimes I stop and think about the crash, and I used to feel my heart rate pick up a little bit, but nowadays it's a calmer sort of recollection. Think about the pilot and who's living his dream, or maybe 20 minutes or so before it turned into a nightmare, and I think about how close I came to becoming part of his story instead of just the guy who watched it end. I was in the wilderness hiking for the longest time, and this is the thing that made me completely quit. I'd been out on the trails all afternoon by the time I got back to my car. The sun started dipping low and my legs ached, and I hadn't seen a single other person all afternoon. But I liked the solitude, and how it allowed me to decompress in a way regular exercise couldn't quite touch. I approached my old blue Subaru Outback, already dreaming of the hot shower that I was going to take as I fished around for my keys. And that's when I saw it. A folded piece of paper tucked tight under my windshield wiper. At first, I figured it was just one of those trail notes. You know, like another hiker warning me about a washed-out section or something. And so I pulled it free, unfolded it right there by the car, and started reading. Now, the handwriting was neat, like someone had taken their time with it, but I think I only got a couple of sentences in before I felt my breath catch in my throat. And the line that made me tense up read something like, "I followed you down a stretch of trail earlier. You didn't see me, but I saw you." And to prove it wasn't just some prank, the person who wrote the note started describing what I was wearing. how I had a red pack, gray hiking pants, and a green long sleeve. He then mentioned watching me stop at a little overlook around noon and how I'd use my jet boil to make a cup of coffee using a small pack of creamer. Now this was all super accurate, and I felt this chill run through me as I realized that it wasn't some kind of joke. I should have stopped reading right there, and I remember literally telling myself to stop, but I couldn't. I legitimately could not drag my eyes away from that page, and so I just kept on skimming it. The note's author went on to explain how easy it would have been to close the gap between us, how the trail was deserted enough for him to be able to come up behind me real quick, knock me down before I knew what was happening. They said that they thought about dragging me off into the thicker woods, where no one would be able to hear me even if they were on the trails. And there they'd be able to do whatever they wanted with me. And although I don't want to go into too much detail about what they wrote, it was very bad. Just know it painted pictures in my mind that no one ought to see of themselves. They ended the note by saying they chose not to. But not only that time, they wanted me to know how close they'd been and how they could have taken everything from me should the mood have struck them. There was no name at the end of it, but no prizes for guessing that. There was just that folded piece of paper and the knowledge that someone had been watching me the whole time when I thought that I'd been alone. I remember spinning around as I lowered the note, terrified the person was still there. I didn't know if it was just one person or a group of them, but as I looked around, I saw the parking lot was completely empty, apart from me and my car, and there was no one watching me from the trees nearby, seemingly. I jammed the note into my pocket, got in my car, and locked the doors fast. I tried to immediately start the engine, but my hands were shaking so bad that I twice dropped the keys before I was able to get them in the ignition. The drive back into town feels like a blur looking back on it because I guess my mind was only barely on the road ahead of me and mostly on that note and what I was going to do about it. I barely slept that night and kept the hike in my head. Had there been a guy in a dark jacket I just hadn't spotted, or did they get all that information on me using some trail cam that I was unaware of? I still couldn't rule out the possibility that it was just a really mean prank, but at the same time, what the person had written was so disturbing that even if it was just some dumb prank, they needed a stern talking to, preferably from someone in law enforcement. And so the next morning I drove straight to the small town police station with the note in a plastic bag, and I told the officer everything. And then after reading over the letter, still in the plastic, he promised that he'd look into it for me. I was hoping that they'd find something, anything to lead them back to whoever wrote it, but even after dusting for prints or checking for DNA and sending in a copy to the handwriting expert upstate, at least that's what he said he did, there were no matches anywhere in their system. They said it sounded like some creep was just trying to rattle me, but without any evidence directly tying it to someone, there wasn't much that they could do about it except advise me to take caution next time I was out hiking. One officer, a kind older guy with a mustache, suggested that I stick to busier trails from now on. He told me people got weird ideas in the backcountry where the rules feel looser, and reiterated that it was probably just some loser trying to scare me. But his words didn't comfort me, not in the way that he intended anyway, because no matter how well-meaning he was, he couldn't promise the guy wouldn't try again, and he couldn't say for sure that it was just a one-time note. Now, the next time I went hiking, which turned out to be my final time ever, I carried a knife and a gun with me and downloaded an app that shared my location with friends and family. Now, I carried pepper spray as well, and on the advice of that friendly cop, only stuck to busier trails and more commercial parks and green spaces, but none of it erased that feeling that I just wasn't safe out there. I just kept thinking about the casual way they described dragging me away. It wasn't just the violence they hinted at, it was the power they asserted over me, reminding me that no matter how strong or prepared I felt, someone could simply decide that I was prey, and that was that. When I got home, I canceled a multi-day backpacking trip that I'd planned for that summer. It hurt to do it, but there was no getting around that note and that it had taken something from me, something precious, and that thing being the peace that I used to find out there on the trails, and it was never coming back. My wife and brother-in-law were almost run off the road by some a-hole in a beat-up truck who swerved way too hard coming onto the highway. They were lucky not to get into some kind of accident. While both of them made it out okay with nothing but the shakes, my wife had already been pretty stressed, and the near miss was sort of the straw which broke the camel's back. Once all the stuff with the cops was said and done, she went to stay with her mom for a couple of weeks, whereas my solution to all the stress we'd been feeling was to head out onto the trails to burn off some steam with some weekend hiking. I grabbed my pack, laced up my boots, and then headed deep into the New Forest. I've been doing the same thing for years, heading out to the same place at around the same time of day too, and it never failed me before. The trail wound through some thick patches of forest, places that felt almost healing. But after I stopped to eat a lunch of some trail bars, things started to feel kind of off. The birds went silent in a way that made my skin prickle, and being based in the United Kingdom instead of my home country of the United States, it wasn't like I had much in the way of weaponry I was allowed to carry to defend myself, really. Unfortunately, I knew it wasn't just nothing. The birds don't go quiet like that unless you're not alone, and that's when the first shot came. Again, as an American, it took me a moment to pick up on the fact that hearing a rifle shot in the UK countryside is a lot scarier than at home. Sure, there are certain gun laws here which I'd never really looked into, but there was still something extremely unsettling about hearing what I realized was my first ever gunshot in the wilds of the United Kingdom. The shot cracked through the air like a bullwhip as it flew over my head, close enough that the bark from a tree exploded 10 feet from behind. And then I guess my brain just shut off and my legs took over, because the next thing I know, I'm sprinting along the trail as fast as they could carry me. Another shot followed, kicking up a patch of dirt in front of me, and that's when I realized that it definitely wasn't just some hunter mistaking me for some game animal, that I'd probably been a dumbass for even entertaining that idea. No, this was deliberate. The shots kept coming, spaced out and patient, not panicked firing, but very deliberate. One would whine past my head, another would splinter a branch nearby, and sweat stung my eyes and the air tasted like metal. I know now that that was the fear I was tasting. One bullet came so close that it felt like it tugged at my sleeve, and the shot slowed but didn't stop entirely. My thoughts turned dark, and I had flashes of my wife back at her mom's, wondering if she'd ever hear what happened to me. I pushed on, aiming for the trail exit miles away. My legs were aching, but adrenaline turned what should have been pain into just the faintest of twinges. Later, much later, after I'd stumbled out and flagged down help, the pieces came together in ways that made the whole thing even more disturbing. Around the same time that I was flagging down a passing motorist to get some help, the police were pulling a guy over. He got nervous when they asked about his van and then lied through his teeth about what was inside. The police searched anyway and found a rifle, scopes, and all kind of gear that screamed preparation. Now, the man turned out to be tied to some Romanian criminal gang, the kind that moves in the shadows and handles dirty work for hire. The man himself was wanted in France and the Netherlands for contract jobs and was only here because he'd smuggled himself into the country illegally. Down at the station, when the police sat me down and laid it out for me, my blood ran cold. Obviously, attempted murder by firearm is a little less common here and taken fairly seriously. They explained the Romanian fella might not be working alone and that another attempt could be coming very soon. They also told me that the traffic accident my wife narrowly avoided was no accident, and that it constituted the gang's first attempt to bump me off. Someone had put a price on my head, a big one too, so the likelihood of the problem just going away was very slim. The police wanted to know what I did for a living, if I had a large life insurance policy, or if my death might result in some amount of inheritance money going to someone else in the family, but none of it applied. I didn't come from a rich family, I didn't have any life insurance policies, and as far as my profession went, I've been a physics researcher at the University of Bristol for the better part of 5 years, after realizing the Ivy League life wasn't for me. Now, I couldn't think of a single logical reason why someone might want me dead, and neither could the police. We didn't waste time arguing or trying to reason the whole thing out. We just packed what we could and disappeared into hiding, moving between safe spots before we found ourselves somewhere permanent and very far away, too. Now, I do all my work remotely. I don't make any public appearances, and I don't go anywhere outdoors at night, even if it's well lit. The police still don't know who put a bounty on my head or why, but they've only got so much to work with. My entire life has been turned upside down, and even all these years later, I still don't know who's responsible or why, and it takes all I am as a man to keep that fact from wearing down my sanity until there's nothing left of me at all. But I'm resigned to stay sane because, and to sort of half borrow a line from Braveheart, they might take my life, but they won't take my dignity. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you get a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links are in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, I'll be playing with my joystick till I'm 100.